The true story of Cleopatra. Only a handful of individuals from the ancient world remain household names all these centuries later, and even fewer are women. But while the hold of this fascinating woman over our imagination has not lessened with time, we have a completely warped sense of who this remarkable woman was and of her historical role. Often presented as some hypersexual seductress, Cleopatra was one of the most influential leaders of her time. She ruled in a politically tricky time with great wisdom and finesse, in a world where female power was distrusted and resented. Her true story is very different from the one you will see in Hollywood movies, but no less spectacular in the line of Ptolemy. Before we talk about the birth of this legendary queen, let's give a bit of background on her remarkable family. In 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died after creating a vast empire through one of human history's most impressive bursts of conquest. The great Macedonian general did not have an established heir. Therefore, the massive amount of land at his disposal was divided between his generals. One of those was Ptolemy, who may have been a half-brother of Alexander. He received the right to rule over Egypt and soon declared himself pharaoh of that proud and ancient land. You would not expect a foreign dynasty like the one Ptolemy established to manage to grow roots in Egypt. However, that is precisely what happened. Ptolemy and those who followed him cleverly combined Greek and Egyptian cultures to create their unique lexicon of power. Most notably, they combined Greek and Egyptian gods. Meanwhile, their monarchs were crowned by the high priest of Ptah in Memphis. However, the Ptolemaic family's homage to Egyptian culture had its limits. They refused to learn the Egyptian language and were governed only by Greek. They also brought great prosperity and progress to Egypt. The city they founded in honor of Alexander the Great, Alexandria, soon became the leader of the ancient world in science and intellectual achievement. Most notably, they established the Library of Alexandria. Simultaneously appealing to Greek and Egyptian culture, the Ptolemaic dynasty laid strong roots in its kingdom, while also forging strong ties with the Roman Republic. The strong connection there was based on two crucial links. First, the Romans greatly admired Hellenic culture. Second, the Romans also grew reliant on Egypt to feed itself. Because of the Nile, the kingdom of Ptolemy became Rome's breadbasket. A queen is born. By the time Cleopatra VII was born, the Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled for 235 years and had established itself as one of the longest ruling families in Egyptian history. We don't know much about her childhood, but it seems Cleopatra's mother passed away when she was young. It is also clear the future queen enjoyed an excellent education. The future queen likely studied at the Museion of Alexandria, a remarkable educational institution founded by Ptolemy I Soter, and likely included the legendary Library of Alexandria. There she learned several languages, including not only her native Koine Greek and Egyptian, but also Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, and Parthian. Her Latin was also reportedly good, which helped Cleopatra ally with and develop intimate relations with some of the most illustrious Roman citizens. Her childhood tutor in oratory and philosophy was Philostratos. Few women in antiquity enjoyed such a comprehensive and well-rounded education. But Cleopatra was thrown from her life of study into the world of power politics when her father, Ptolemy II, passed away in 51 BCE. His children, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, inherited the crown together. Generally, males were preferred as kings at that time, but since Cleopatra was 8 years older than the young Ptolemy and he was just 11, they were given the crown jointly. It appears that the two were married not long after. While this is somewhat disgusting to us, incestuous marriages to consolidate the bloodline were common in Hellenic dynasties. At first, the practice was highly controversial, but by the time Cleopatra did it, it had become the norm for her dysfunctional but powerful family. You may also be grateful to hear that there is also a perfect chance that marriage was never consummated. Ptolemy was too young, and it was more of a fierce rivalry than a loving marriage. As she was the adult among the two regions, it was left to Cleopatra to deal with the problems of Egypt, and boy were there many to reckon with. The country she inherited was in terrible shape. By that time, Egypt was no longer a proud and independent kingdom. It had been reduced to a vassal of the Roman Republic. There was a drought, which wasn't helped by the princely sum of 17.5 million drachmas the kingdom owed to Rome. Meanwhile, Unemployed Roman soldiers left behind from a previous operation were raiding the countryside and causing an impressive amount of chaos. How Cleopatra defeated her brother? Around 51 BCE, the queen made a play to rule as a single regent. We know that because documents from that year featured only her name, ignoring the prepubescent Ptolemy III. She made essential power moves by consolidating support amongst the Egyptian priesthood. Many would grow rich during Cleopatra's reign and prove to be strong allies. Many men in court did not appreciate the ambitious queen's overreaching. In particular, Pothinos, an ambitious eunuch who was the administrator of the king's properties, plotted against Cleopatra. Soon the young Ptolemy III had his sister on the back foot. By 49 BCE, documents bore his name first. Indeed, the young Ptolemy, or more likely the advisors behind the throne, soon tried to dispose of the queen. They began to issue decrees with the king's name preceding the queen. Cleopatra was forced to flee Egypt a year after they took the throne, but she was not one to give up without a fight. The young queen raised a formidable army in Syria and marched it to face her brother/husband/enemy. In 48 BCE, the two Egyptian regents clashed at Pelusium near the kingdom's eastern frontiers. However, the clash of arms did not settle things. Instead, developments related to Roman politics brought the sibling rivalry to a close. During those years, the uneasy alliance between the legendary generals Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar collapsed. In 49 BCE, the Senate declared Julius Caesar an enemy of the state. 6 days later, he famously crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome. The road was paved to an all-out war between the two. Caesar soon won it decisively when the Pompeian army was defeated in Pharsalus, a union of power. The defeated general escaped to Egypt, where he had long enjoyed close relations with the Ptolemaic dynasty. However, he was betrayed by the young Ptolemy III, who ordered his assassination. He did so for two reasons. The Egyptian king feared that Pompey would take over the country. He also calculated that Caesar was more robust, and winning his approval by killing the main obstacle to his power seemed like a good idea. Ptolemy then had the head delivered to Caesar, who had in the meantime arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his now dead rival. The Egyptian king probably thought Caesar would be delighted. However, it did not turn out that way. The general was outraged that a foreign king would treat a Roman hero with such disrespect. He grieved deeply, calling on the Ptolemaic siblings to surrender their arms and reconcile. Caesar also demanded that Egypt repay its substantial debt to Rome. Ptolemy responded by gathering his army and defying Caesar and his men. Meanwhile, Cleopatra took a different approach. She put on her best clothes and makeup and went to see the great general personally. The queen had heard that Caesar had a penchant for romance with royal women and tried to take advantage of that fact by drawing closer to the most powerful man in the Mediterranean world. The Egyptian king was not amused and ordered his troops to besiege the palace where Cleopatra and Julius Caesar were residing. At this point, Ptolemy declared his younger sister Arsinoe IV the new queen, declaring Cleopatra's rule to be illegitimate. As Cleopatra and Caesar were trapped together, a love affair blossomed between them. It was always a bad idea to make Caesar your enemy. While trapped, he called for reinforcements from Greece and elsewhere, and they arrived in 47 BCE. The general also organized a naval fleet to defeat the Egyptians and free him and his men. Caesar won a maritime engagement in the great harbor of Alexandria. Ptolemy III tried to escape by boat, but he drowned. Cleopatra finally beat her sibling rival and had Julius Caesar as her lover and ally, a powerful position indeed. That alliance was further cemented when the queen gave birth to a baby sired by the Roman strongman. Caesarion was born on June 23, 47 BCE, and became the heir apparent to the Ptolemaic throne. Caesar appointed Cleopatra's younger brother as Ptolemy IV, and he nominally married his sister to become co-regent. But she never left the bed of her famous lover, and that incestuous marriage was not consummated. Caesar left Egypt for good in April of 47 BCE. He had to consolidate his political power elsewhere. But Caesar also had a wife in Rome and may not have wanted to recognize the son from his illicit affair. But Julius left a sizable military force behind to secure Cleopatra against her enemies. The queen arrived in Rome the following year with her brother husband. It is not clear if the baby Caesarion joined them. Caesar awarded the two regents the legal status of friend and ally of the Roman people. She either remained consecutively in the grand Italian city for the next 2 years or went back and forth. The historical record on this point is unclear. However, Cleopatra was in Rome when Julius Caesar was famously assassinated by a cabal of plotters on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. She then spent the next month trying to put Caesarion in power. However, she was not well connected enough to do so. In addition, the Roman political tradition was not monarchical, and they did not place children as leaders but as adults who ran for public office. Therefore, she left after Octavian was named the heir as commanded in Caesar's will. Enter Mark Antony. Though disappointed with that outcome, Cleopatra backed Octavian and Mark Antony against Julius Caesar's assassins. Soon, Rome's territories were divided between Antony's armies in the east and Octavian's armies in the west. From his camp in Tarsus, located in modern-day Turkey, Antony invited Cleopatra to join him. They had met in the past when both were much younger. Indeed, the Roman general claimed to have met Cleopatra while serving in Egypt when she was a 14-year-old princess. He said that he had fallen in love with her then and there. However, modern historians are not sure of the veracity of that claim. He definitely met her a few years later, in 48 BCE, while supporting Caesar in Egypt. Either way, Antony wanted to join forces with Cleopatra and secure an alliance with Egypt against Octavian. He also wanted to develop a more intimate relationship with the queen. He had learned from Caesar that a love affair with Cleopatra was a useful tool. Egypt was a source of troops, naval bases, and most importantly, control over the most crucial resource of the time: wheat. Rome did not grow enough food to support its large urban population and relied on Egypt to feed its large and often rebellious masses. Initially, the queen hesitated but decided to sail to Tarsus in her massive yacht. There, the two held 3 massive banquets on 3 nights in a row. Before Antony and his men, she presented herself as the incarnation of Isis and Aphrodite. Once this divine courtship was over, she invited the general to Alexandria. He came without troops and was well received in Egypt. Cleopatra invited him to her bed and had 3 children with Antony. It was a brilliant way to secure patronage and provide a further claim to her heirs to one day rule over Rome. Indeed, unlike Caesar, he recognized his children and proved a willing patron. She used her influence over him to get lands the Romans had annexed returned to the Ptolemy dynasty. However, Antony was not remarkably faithful to the Egyptian queen. In 40 BCE, he married Octavia and had 2 children with her, but she wouldn't let something as silly as fidelity get in the way of her helpful relationship with a Roman leader. When he summoned her to meet in Greece, she brought his children, and he bestowed more lands and titles upon Cleopatra. She now controlled parts of Lebanon, Libya, Saudi Arabia, and Palestine as well. Defeat to Octavian. While Mark Antony was building an empire alongside Cleopatra in the east, his rival Octavian was putting his control over Rome and the west to good use. The brilliant young politician sensed Antony's ties to the Egyptian queen could be a liability. Octavian began a public relations campaign depicting Antony as a lecherous fool willing to sell out Roman interests to please Cleopatra. He also took up the cause of Octavia and said Antony had abandoned his legal wife to chase a foul foreign temptress. Also, Octavia was his sister, so this was personal. In the meantime, Antony hoped to prove his worth by defeating the Parthian Empire. Cleopatra accompanied him, believing the father of her children would become the next Alexander the Great. However, things did not turn out that way. He suffered a catastrophic defeat in 35 BCE and returned to Alexandria to lick his wounds. After that, he managed to defeat the Armenians. To make up for his defeat to the Parthians, Antony held a Roman-style triumph in Alexandria. He celebrated with Cleopatra as she played the role of Isis Aphrodite, and Mark represented Dionysus Osiris. Their children were also portrayed as gods and given vast kingdoms of land that belonged to Rome in Cyprus, Libya, Syria, and elsewhere. Antony later named Caesarion the heir of Rome. The Romans were outraged at this, and what they saw as a betrayal of Roman values and interests. This gave Octavian the excuse he needed to move against Antony. But to avoid accusations that he was starting a civil war, Octavian had the Senate declare war on Cleopatra instead of Antony. Cleopatra and Antony had more enormous armies, but much was taken from client states with less than professional soldiers. Meanwhile, Octavian had more Roman legions and hardened warriors. Therefore, Antony's force was swiftly defeated in the decisive naval battle between the forces off the coast of Actium in Greece. The royal couple escaped to Egypt and separated. She tried negotiating with Octavian who advised her to separate from Antony. Therefore, Cleopatra had a message sent to Antony telling him that he had committed suicide. He fell into despair and took his own life. When she heard Octavian planned to parade her and her children in a Roman triumph, she told the new triumphant emperor to be, "I will not be led in a triumph." She reportedly committed suicide by allowing an asp to bite her, waiting for the poison to take hold. Her son Caesarion was murdered not long after. The queen and her kingdom were dead, but her legend lived on. A different kind of queen. There are so many interesting elements to Cleopatra's legacy. One is her attitude to local culture. Once she established herself as queen, Cleopatra took her own unique approach to ruling Egypt. Though she had little or no Egyptian blood, Cleopatra VII had more respect for local culture than her predecessors. According to Plutarch, she was the first in her house to learn Egyptian. She also identified herself with the goddess Isis to cement control over the local population. That was a good choice because that deity had many powers and areas of influence, including magic, healing, and the power of giving life. Isis was also depicted as a beautiful queen on a throne, so the identification was quite apartment. Another unique element of Cleopatra's personality was her unwillingness to engage in traditional gender roles. She was famously voracious in her sexual appetite and seduced men to gain power and influence, discarding them when need be. Cleopatra also enjoyed Cleopatra gambling, drinking a lot, and hunting. All of those were considered masculine pursuits at the time. Indeed, they still are. Was Cleopatra beautiful? Finally, let's settle one of the great debates surrounding Cleopatra. Was she a beautiful woman, and what did she look like? With most major historical figures, that is not our main concern. But in this case, that is quite different. There are three main reasons for that. First, in our society, we often judge women primarily based on their looks. That was true in the 1st century BC and remains so today. Second, portrayals of the great queen in movies and books often depict her as a sultry, oriental beauty. Third, part of her power and infamy comes from Cleopatra's ability to seduce the most powerful men in the world at the time, including Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Therefore, her sexual allure had historical consequences. In the movies, she has traditionally been portrayed by some of the great sex symbols of their era. Perhaps most famously, Elizabeth Taylor played her in a blockbuster 1963 feature film, but she was also portrayed by Vivien Leigh, Angelina Jolie, Sophia Loren, Theda Bara, and many others. Hollywood did not create the myth of Cleopatra's beauty. It has much earlier roots. The great Roman historian Cassius Dio described her as a woman of surpassing beauty. Meanwhile, Shakespeare, as always, said it best: age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Other women cloy the appetites they feed, but she makes hungry, where most she satisfies. But this was not an innocent description. Mark Antony's enemies, led by the brilliant Octavian, tried to paint an unflattering picture of the man to weaken his popularity in Rome. Therefore, they portrayed Antony as a weak-willed man, led astray by a foul foreign temptress. Exaggerating the sexual allure of Cleopatra served their political purposes. Then, there are the specifics of her looks. You know how you imagine Cleopatra: dark skin, exotic beauty, and too much eye makeup. That makes sense when you think of her as a native Egyptian queen, but of course that was not the case. She was the product of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which originated in Macedonia. That means she was ethnically Greek and not Egyptian. That would immediately shift her likely features and skin tone to a more classically European style. We have some portrayals of Cleopatra and her looks for our perusal. Perhaps the best representation is a marble bust from the latter part of the 1st century BCE, currently located in the Altes Museum in Germany. It shows her face surrounded by curly hair gathered into a bun atop the royal diadem sits. She has attractive almond-shaped eyes and soft features. However, her nose is very prominent in a way that does not conform to Western beauty standards. Another bust, which was found in Rome, is quite similar. It has fuller lips, and though the nose is missing, it appears to be quite large because of the space provided for it on her face. Either way, the reality was probably significantly less spectacular than the Hollywood illusion. The Greek historian Plutarch explained, "For her beauty, as we are told, was in itself not altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her. But she managed to convince men and sometimes seduce them with what he called her irresistible charm." But if we think about it, what Plutarch is describing here is not so much conventional attractiveness, but charisma. Cleopatra was an influential leader who often got what she wanted, and much like powerful and persuasive men, many found her attractive. As Henry Kissinger once said, power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. Conclusion: it has been suggested that Cleopatra changed the course of history through her romance with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Blaise Pascal famously said, Cleopatra's nose, had it been shorter, the whole face of the world would have been changed. In other words, a small change to her face may have made Cleopatra less attractive, and the entire Roman Civil War could have been avoided. Others think broader patterns and processes determine history. You ask yourself, did Cleopatra and her nose change the world, or did she give us some great stories?